when I got to Puerto Rico, my daughter at that point being less than 2 years old, um, she could not speak English or understand English. So one of the first things I had to do was talk my wife into, let's you and I teach her a little bit of English now that she speaks Spanish well. So that became something that really bothered me some later on. But my assignment was to Fort Carson, Colorado, where I was assigned to the 5th Mechanized Division, Infantry Division Mechanized. And having arrived at the division, they in turn assigned me to the 2nd Battalion, 10th Infantry. And the battalion commander there was Lieutenant Colonel William E. LeGros. And Bill LeGros had been the G2 for the 1st Infantry Division on his tour in Vietnam. And he assigned me as company commander of Bravo Company. Bill and his wife Mary LeGros did more to enhance the stature of the officer corps in the Army than most of the other people I've ever been associated with. He served in a very difficult time, having in the battalion soldiers that were either knowing that they were on their way to Vietnam, or soldiers who came back from Vietnam and didn't care because they were getting out in 6 months or less. Officers that were the captains were returning veterans from Vietnam. The lieutenants were on their way to Vietnam. So he gave us the charge to his captains, the job of training the platoon leaders and the troops to go to Vietnam and do their best to take care of the ones who were going home. And he instructed us in turn to give the charge to the platoon sergeants, who almost all had been in Vietnam also, to make sure that they included the training of those platoon leaders in how to be platoon leaders in combat, because there was a very good chance that they as well would be going back over there, and these officers could end up being their platoon leaders, and keep that in mind whenever they went there. In our companies, we would have anywhere from 110 to 160 troops. We were supposed to be organized into 4 platoons with three rifle platoons and a support platoon, a weapons platoon, and you had a headquarters section as well. That meant that you had 4 platoon leaders, 1 executive officer, who was normally the senior lieutenant, and then the company commander, me. And due to the increased troop buildup for Vietnam and the fact that all officers had to serve in a non-war zone situation for at least 4 months before they could deploy to the war zone, they sent us lieutenants out of OCS as quickly as they could. At several times I had 10 and 11 lieutenants assigned to me where I should have 4. When you only have 110 to 150, 60 troops, you can't really give each one of them a sufficient amount of troop leading time. So we would try to rotate the best we could, and we had officers, lieutenants with primary duty as being motor officer, being mess officer, being supply officer, whatever, while we were rotating other people through platoon steps. That was a very, very challenging job. We also had the troops that, like I said, they just flat didn't care and were going home and didn't perform and had a hard time keeping them motivated. The battalion commander would, and his wife, at least once a quarter, would host a get-together for all the battalion officers and their wives or significant others at their quarters. And their quarters were small. These were not the large quarters from the 20s, 30s, and 40s that you see on many army posts. These were the new, what they call K-Park quarters, which were probably not much more than 1,600 to 2,000 square feet for a lieutenant colonel. And there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 70 officers. And when you include the spouses, significant others, that's a fairly sizable number. Well, they would host this at their expense, and they would have the people over and try to do their best in teaching the young officers Army social life, and teach the wives and significant others their parts in that social life. And that was a monumental effort. Excuse me.
I'll take a drink of water.
I'm fine. And then another thing that was very common at that point, and not as common anymore, but the Officers Club were very much in existence in the mid-60s and late 60s. And every Friday you had an officers' call at the club. And there was normally some kind of entertainment at the club. At that point, there were in 67, 68, when I was at Fort Carson, that was primarily bands of some kind, singers, etc. Later on, it evolved into a little bit more raucous entertainment, but not at places where I was stationed. And the thing was to get as many of your officers there. Well, it was a command function you had to attend. A roll was called basically by the battalion adjutant. So you had to show up. You didn't have to stay forever, but you had to show up. And to get the best seat in the house, you had to have someone go over there and establish that seating. That was the job of the adjutant. He would often assign that and delegate that to another lieutenant, normally the junior lieutenant in the battalion, who would be over there between 1 and 2 in the afternoon to stake out the tables that we would have for our battalion officers. We also had a ceremony over there that no longer would be allowed in the Army, but it was back then. You had a trophy that presented to the person who had made the biggest screw up for the week. And that trophy in our battalion's area was a plunger. And that plunger had a big dog tag chain attached to it, and whomever the last person winning that would have a dog tag with his name on it, not serial number, etc., but name added to that each week. And when presented to the winner, it would be filled with beer, and the recipient would have to drink out of that plunger for the remainder of that happy hour. And then he would be responsible for having that plunger with him, that trophy with him, that whole next week until it was awarded to someone else. And if he was found without having that in his possession, he would retain it for an additional week. So that was an interesting little part that we had. My sister company was Alpha Company, and A Company was commanded by Larry Wissell, Lawrence J. Wissell. And he'd also had a tour in Vietnam, and he'd served with the 101st. And he'd come back from Vietnam, and when he came back, he'd found out that his wife had spent everything that he sent back to him on her boyfriend. And of course that resulted in a divorce. And after he was separated from her, he started dating another woman whom he thought he was going to marry. And he knew that he wanted to make the Army a career, and he knew that he would be going back to Vietnam. So he volunteered to go back early, even though he came back from Vietnam after I did. He was assigned to the battalion probably in October, November time frame. I had been assigned in the late September time frame. He volunteered to go back and went back earlier. And long story short, he came in country, and the Stars and Stripes I saw when I came to Vietnam, he'd been killed in action. And that was one of my personally harder losses to take. While we were both company commanders at Fort Carson, we would have a lot of competitions amongst the two companies. We'd go out on morning PT runs and see who could run the fastest, the longest, and keep formations the best. We would inspect each other companies. We would go out on field problems and basically play war games against each other. We would figure out ways to have stakes out in the field, have the mess sergeants do some trading of such things as I learned earlier, of coffee and other, maybe a six-pack of beer or whatever, and be able to load up with enough steaks to feed our companies when we're out in the field. And that in turn would get the troops more involved and get the troops more excited about doing these kinds of things. And which was all boiled down to basic training that we were trying to accomplish. I stayed as company commander from the time I came back there until about a year later, which would have been in the fall of '68, at which time the then new battalion commander, which was Lieutenant Colonel Matson, Hugo Matson, came in as Bill Grove was changed to another job. And he said, "You've been there long enough." So he moved me to be Battalion S4 and someone else to go over my company. The S4, the warrant officer in there, the property book officer, had not had an S4 for some time, so he'd been acting as the property book officer. So when I was assigned to him, he said, and I'll never forget his line, he said, "Sir, I'm so damn glad for you to be assigned in here as the S4 so that you can go attend the meetings while I can get some work done." So he was sick and tired of attending meetings, wanted to go back to what his job was. And I served in that capacity. I got orders while I was there to return to Vietnam, and I was assigned to the 101st Airborne, and I came in, or I left for my deployment leave in November, and I arrived back in Vietnam in December of '68. One of the things that happened at Fort Carson while I was there, not in my battalion, but in other battalions, was that the first aspect of racial strife that I had seen came about. There were some supposed gang-type rumbles between blacks and whites in the troop areas, which was very sad to see as far as I was concerned. Other people that I served with at Fort Carson, my first sergeant actually had been in the 196th. I didn't know him over there, and he was a sergeant first class named Gordon Dustin, and that I still keep in touch with. He retired as a sergeant first class, and I thought that was very unfair by the Army. I thought he should have been higher in rank. My Charlie Company commander was Captain Patterson, Lance Patterson, that I later stayed with when I went through airborne school with he and his wife. Lieutenant Bob Denning, Robert Denning, who was a lieutenant in Charlie Company and later became the battalion adjutant, and I was his best man at his wedding while he was out there. One of my lieutenants, I was also best man for, Lieutenant Nick Harding. And Lieutenant, my XO was Lieutenant Brown, and I don't recall too many of the others that we had, but the other thing that happened of great significance while at Fort Carson, in the spring of 1968, one of the things that we were all had to do as part of our training was riot control training on a continuous basis. In the spring of 1968, I had worked many weekends without having a break, and I talked my battalion commander into letting me take a long 3-day pass to drive my wife and daughter to Chicago, where her sister lived, and she was going to stay there for a couple of days and fly to Puerto Rico to see our parents. And we left Thursday night, Friday morning at right after midnight, which was when we could legally go, and we drove straight through to Chicago and got there about I'd say maybe 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. And not having seen each other for a while, the adults stayed up and had a few drinks and talked and whatever fairly late, and got up in the morning, and my brother-in-law was going to drive around and show me the town. They lived in North Riverside outside Chicago, and as we came back to the townhouse that they were renting, my wife was standing on the steps waving and screaming frantically at me, and I opened the window to find out, and it said, your battalion commander wants you to call him back. And I said, uh-oh. So I called back and didn't get the battalion commander. I got my executive officer, and he said that they'd been alerted to go to Chicago because what we hadn't heard that night when we were sitting around talking was that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And the riots had flared up all over the country, and our battalion had been charged to come to Chicago. Well, we didn't know, or my XO didn't know at that point where they were going. So he said, we'd been alerted that we're going someplace. And so I called my battalion commander and asked him, I said, do you want me to fly back or can I drive back? And he said, go ahead and drive. And I drove back, and I left, I slept some Saturday afternoon before I left, and drove straight back to Fort Carson. By the time I got there, they'd all left to fly to Chicago. Okay, so we sort of passed in the night somewhere or other. And so I ended up being in charge of the rear detachment when I was there. And I really didn't miss a lot, as the troops primarily were garrisoned in tents in a park somewhere in downtown Chicago. And my troops learned that the Chicago cops know how to play poker. And they lost a lot of money to the various Chicago cops that they were around. But they came back and went down. And then later on that same year, while I was still company commander, we came back to Chicago again to the Democratic National Convention. And at that point we were billeted at the Great Lakes Naval Air Station, and we ended up not being deployed into the city at all for the period of time that we were there. But that was two little bit of different things that we ended up being involved in. So that takes me to going back to Vietnam. My wife and daughter again went back to Puerto Rico, and during that year my wife had 3 miscarriages, and so we still had 1 child. And I went back to Vietnam. This time I flew from, I was actually in Puerto Rico on leave, and I took a hop from Ramey Air Force Base in Puerto Rico, and I thought it might take several days to get to Travis. I got a flight on a KC-135 tanker, and went directly to the West Coast, and where they have what they call a West Coast shuttle, and I got to Travis the same day I left Ramey Air Force Base. So I had a few days to kill out there, and I ended up staying with a lieutenant that I talked about earlier, Tim Schlink, who'd been a platoon lead in the C Company with me with the 196. and I stayed with he and his wife in San Jose, and really didn't do much of anything until it was time for me to go. Then when I went back, I left from Travis. I went on a military charter in normal civilian aircraft, probably a 707 as I recall, and flew into Tansanut. Actually flew into Benoit Air Base, and there they took us to Long Bend, the replacement depot, and they called it Repo Depot, 22nd Replacement Battalion, I think it was. And there, even though I had orders, and as did many others, the system didn't work quite well, so you had to hang around until you got the orders to actually deploy to where you were going. The 101st at that point the division was located in northern I Corps, but they had a rear detachment, a training area on the Benoit Army side of the air base. And so I went over there first, and what they had there, they called the Screaming Eagle Replacement Training School, CERTS. And that's where they would train the people coming in country for the first time, put them through acclimatization and refiring M16s, zeroing M16s, etc. And that would normally take them a couple of weeks. I stayed there about a week. Did not have to go through any of that because I was on my second tour. Did have my one big shot in my Army career at actually winning in poker, because I had money that I didn't need. And I ended up going into the club and starting out with $500 and came out with an excess of $2,000 that evening. And never had I won that kind of money any time, any place. But as it was, it took it all the way, and it went up north. I came into the brigade, and the brigade S1 was Major Dale Burrows, also on his second tour, Special Forces type, and never met the brigade commander or the XO. Major Burrows just said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Like everybody else, I want to become a commander." And he says, "Yeah, but we don't have any slots. How about an S3 then, or assistant 3? He said, "We don't have any of those either. Nothing open." I had an S1 position in the 2nd Battalion. I said, "Fine." So I became the S1 in the 2nd Battalion, 506th Airborne Infantry. And the battalion commander at that point, I just saw his name the other day. Anyway, he was at the end of his tenure, but I served under a battalion commander when I first got there. My XO that I worked for was Major William Burns. And we were set up in a barrack type situation, and I had probably 5 or 6 clerks and a personnel NCO working for me. And that was had the main part of the barracks. Looking forward from my desk, I had the officers of the battalion S3, the operations officer, although he was never in that office. He had one in his own section. And also for the executive officer, Major Burns, the command sergeant major, and the battalion commander. And it was important that I tell you where the executive officer was, because he was down that corridor from me and door on that side. And whenever he didn't like anything that had happened that had any way, shape, or form, anything to do with me, he would come storming out of his room and come running down to my desk and stand in front of it and scream and holler and yell. And initially I took that not with a grain of salt, and I would get quite upset that he'd be chewing me out, basically, for most of the time things that I had absolutely nothing to do with. And after a while, I just sort of got used to it, and he would come out and yell and scream and whatever, and I'd just say, yes sir, no sir, yes sir, no sir. And he'd turn around and go back in, and if there was something that I had something to do with, I'd wait half an hour, and I'd go into his office and then tell him what the solution was, and he would be fine. So I also had, in that S1 shop, my awards and decorations clerk, and I had a Spec 5 who was my senior typist. And that typist could do something that I have not seen before or since. He could type at approximately 120 words a minute off of another document and conduct a conversation with me, all concurrently. He's a bright kid, very bright kid. My awards and decorations clerk was a kid named Blaisdell, Spec 4, and Blaisdell had a degree, I think, in chemistry, but the Blaisdell family, as I understood from him, was part of the family that owned and or controlled Zippo manufacturing. And he probably could have gotten himself out of being drafted if he so desired, but he didn't do so. And he came over and he was the A&D clerk. And he said he was going to write a book when he finished. And he was going to say, I told it like it wasn't. That's what, when you were in combat in Vietnam, there are a lot of heroic actions that took place. And very seldom did anyone have time to sit down and write those actions up properly to reward those heroic actions. And what would happen more often than not would be that the company commander would call back and say, I have awards that I need to make, have done. And they would say, okay, I will get Blaisdell. And they would get Blaisdell on the radio. And Blaisdell would go in there with his map and or where the action was taking place, and a notepad. And he would take down notes to the best of his ability and follow that on the map. And often the radio transmission could not go on as long, or whatever is needed to get everything in detail. So if Blaisdell got the primary things down, he would then go back and write up the award. And he would war game it on his map the way it would make sense to write it up for him. Now, was that exactly what happened? Maybe not, but that is how it would end up being written, and would not serve to diminish the actions or the heroism that took place by the troops that did so. And so that's why he would, and by the way, he'd also use the operational logs from the S3 section to do that. So he didn't lie, he just might not have told it exactly the way it happened. And certainly the people he wrote up for deserve what they got. In January or February, a new battalion commander came in. His name was Gene T. Sherron, S-H-E-R-R-O-N. And his job before he came to take over the battalion had been the deputy director of what was called Project Count. Project Count was to find out what all the materials that they had at Long Bin Depot were, because there was stuff in there that no one knew anything about. And they did so by taking it from this side of the depot to a new side of the depot, and then cataloging what they put in the new side of the depot. So that's what he'd been doing before. It wasn't quite as bad as my company commander on my first tour, but he wasn't quite up to some of the others that I saw, although he was better than many, quite a few. And he came in and he did something that I had not seen of his predecessor. He did go out in the field with the companies. I did spend time with him. But when he went out to the field with his companies, he would ask me before he left on a daily basis. I had to write a letter to his wife. And if I had not talked to him that day, I was to tell her that I had talked to him that day to make sure that she knew that he was okay. So I ended up carrying on a dialogue with his wife for probably 2 or 3 months in letters, off and on, whenever he went to the field. Also a little different assignment. And I still keep in touch with Colonel Sharon. He retired as a full colonel, and he got his doctorate and became a professor at Florida State University, from which he has since retired. I think he's a very smart man, but I don't think his basic rank should have been infantry. And I do think highly of him as a person. While he was still there, several of the companies came open, and he asked me which company I wanted, and I told him I wanted B Company, and he gave me B Company to command. The previous commander was Cecil Kealahua, that everyone referred to as Captain K. And he'd been a very good company commander, and that's one reason I wanted to take over that company, because I knew it was well staffed. I don't remember who had either Charlie or Delta Company, but A Company was Captain Marvin Jeffcoat. And Captain Jeffcoat, later on, as a lieutenant colonel, commanded a peacekeeping force in Sinai. And when that peacekeeping force rotated back from Sinai, that was the plane that went down in Newfoundland, killing all aboard, Marvin Jeffcoat included. And that's one reason why I remember him quite well. Captain Kealahua, Captain K, also retired as full colonel. The last time I knew, he was assigned to ROTC training division out of Fort Bragg, based at Fort Bragg. The person who came in as the supply officer, the S4, while I was still S1, was Vince Felleter. Vince Felleter had served his first tour in Korea, and this was his second overseas tour, but first in Vietnam. And he later took over A Company. The people that I remember, other than Major Burns, the XO was Major Vader, and he was excellent officer, excellent operations officer, and he served, I think, for as long as Colonel Sharon was there. In I think it was April, I took over B Company, and probably had about 130 people or so in the company. A common problem we had in Vietnam was keeping people in the field, troops that were healthy in the field, and not just healthy, unhealthy, but getting them out there could be a problem depending upon what kind of missions we're on. So we would have normally between 110 and 130 people in the field, while we might have 140 to 160 assigned. The others might be in rear area for various reasons. We refer to them as sick, lame, and lazy, or they would be there for detail. They would have to come back for some kind of administrative action. They were back to go on R&R. They would be back there to because they were getting ready to go home, and we normally have them back no less than 2 weeks before they were scheduled to go home. And if we didn't have a replacement coming out at the same time, we would have less people. My company clerk was a Sergeant Chuck Hansen, and he'd come over originally with the 101st in the fall or earlier of '68, and he had extended, or he extended shortly after I got there, so that gave him um, a year and a half in country, and then he extended again, so he ended up with 2 years in country. When you go on extension leaves out of Vietnam, they sent you 1 month any place you want to go. His first time, and that's where he was when I took over the company, it was in Australia. And he spent approximately 1 month with a family out on the ranch somewhere and living with them, and just had a great time. On his second deployment leave, he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Very interesting guy. Still keep in touch with him as well. He lives in Moorhead, Minnesota. My XO was Lieutenant Lewis. One of my lieutenants was Lieutenant Jordan. And I don't remember a whole bunch of the other people. One of my acting platoon sergeant was Sergeant Stancroft. He was or acting platoon sergeant and platoon leader. I had my forward observer was Jim Myers, and Jim was a little interesting as well. He'd degree from University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. He came in the Army and went through artillery OCS, and then they decided to send him to a language school, and they sent him to Vietnamese language school at Monterey for over 6 months, and then they sent him to Vietnam. When he went to Vietnam, he was still a second lieutenant, and the people at MACV looked at him and said, "You're a second lieutenant?" He said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, we're not going to send you to be an advisor anywhere. No one's going to pay any credence to you as a second lieutenant." So even having gone through all the Vietnamese training, they assigned him to the 101st. And he had not learned how to adjust artillery since he was in OCS, which he'd mostly forgotten. So he came to the 101st as basically raw fresh meat. He was immediately assigned to I don't remember the designation of the unit, but that was the unit that assaulted Hamburger Hill in the Shau Valley. And various other people were either killed or wounded, and he ended up being the first officer on top of Hamburger Hill, and gave me a very direct report on what had actually happened up there, which when he got up there, there were people, North Vietnamese or Viet Cong, whatever, that had lived through numerous B-52 strikes in their firing positions and tunnels up there, and came out of their fighting positions up there, still bleeding from their ears and eyes and firing their weapons. And there weren't many, but there were enough that they had to finish them off before they could proceed. And because of what he had gone through there, he'd had some conflict, and I'm not sure exactly what that was, and he was reassigned, and he came to my company, and because I was needing an FO. And I was very thankful to have him, because I didn't have an officer as an FO. And Jim did an excellent job, and having learned a lot about being an FO from my first tour with Lieutenant Escobedo, I knew a whole bunch more than Jim Myers did, and was able to basically wean him into the position, and I felt like I did a pretty good job, because I felt like he did a very good job after he got into it. And for his action going up Hamburger Hill, he was awarded a Bronze Star B. The common missions interspersed would time back either at base camp or at a fire support base was to go on company-sized patrol missions. And we did a lot of that, both in the coastal areas and into the mountains. The 101st big mission was going into the Shau Valley and closing down that portion of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that came through there. That probably delayed the Tet 60 or would have delayed the Tet-68 and prevented another one from happening in '69 or thereabouts from that same area. But in the Shau Valley, which has a base of about 300 meters and goes up over a mile high on each side of the valley, we found trucks buried into the hillside several hundred meters up from the bottom of the valley, hidden amongst the foliage in that triple canopy jungle. We found a cable this big around going up to what were command posts overlooking Way and other areas in the lowlands. We found stairs that had been obviously engineered into the mountainside. It was unbelievable what they had done in that area. One of the things that we also did in that area, we went on a joint mission with some Marines in our coastal area on what's called Amtraks, or they are not much more than armored personnel carriers with wheels on them, and they swim, or they are supposed to swim. And we went around some marshes and low-lying areas with those, where our troops initially stayed inside until the drivers said, "Don't do that," and it got everybody on top. And we found out that there was reason for that. When the first Amtrak didn't float, something had punctured it, and even though all the seals had been properly checked before they went in, it didn't float, and it was flooded by water. So we learned quickly, when you're in an Amtrak, stay on top.
Yeah, about 20 minutes.
20 minutes more?
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't have to float.
Okay. Then the mission that is probably the worst mission that I've ever had, and lasted for the longest period of time that I've had, was as company commander there. When I was given the mission to go from Fire Sport Base Airborne, which was on the east side of the Shau Valley, overlooked, in fact, Hamburger Hill. And I first moved up that eastern slope to over a mile high to, I forget what the name of the little fire sport base up there was, Berchtesgaden. No, it was Eagle's Nest. It wasn't even a fire sport base, just Eagle's Nest. That was over a mile high. We walked up there, and then we came back down to the vicinity of Airborne, and then we went on a combat assault late in the evening from there to the other side of the valley, where we landed after dusk, or at dusk, or shortly thereafter, with no intel as to what was there, and no idea what I was supposed to do, except I was supposed to move to a certain location the next day and start clearing an LZ. Well, the NVA and Viet Cong aren't as dumb as that. When they hear helicopters coming in, they know that there are Americans there. So shortly after we came in and were situated, we got attacked relatively hard. And I lost a couple that night, now several wounded. And the next day, we moved to the first LZ that we were supposed to clear. When you're clearing an LZ in the middle of the jungle, you cannot do it quietly. They came out with helicopters, lowered chainsaws to us. We quickly found out that chainsaws and teak wood, it doesn't work. It cuts for a little bit, then they're loud. But even so, the chainsaws are pretty loud. So we decided a quicker method would be a C4 and dead cord. And that worked pretty good, but that's not very quiet either. And but that is basically what we did. We would clear an area large enough for helicopters to land, and they wanted at least 5 helicopters to be able to land concurrently, simultaneously. And that's a pretty good sized LZ. And every morning after we had done an LZ, we got hit. And this went on. When I left Farsport Base Airborne, I had approximately 140 people. About 45 days later, when they finally agreed to let me come to be taken out of the field, I had, including my command group, I had 47 in the company. Now, that doesn't mean that they were all killed or wounded. I had people leave for the various reasons I stated before, going R&R, return home, administrative reasons. At least one guy with a broken leg, other things that happened.
So you came out with a third of what you went in?
Yeah. And to say that that's a company, that's poor. And that's probably the beginning of what happened to me later on. But I complained rather vociferously at that point. And then I went back to base camp and got, in fact, we went to what was called the Screaming Eagle Beach, which was one of the first R&R site south of Way. A beautiful location, immediately next to a Navy airboat location, like a riverine force kind of place, swift boat kind of thing. And there, the troops were guarded by someone else, and they could let loose and do whatever in the world they wanted. And some of the officers did as well, or we went over to the little bitty officer country on the Navy base. But that lasted for about 3 or 4 days, and then they put it back out in the field. But we got more people in. We got people that had been waiting for us to go out, and we went back out with probably 120 or so when we went back out. And we did most of our, almost all of our missions were company-sized. Almost all of our missions were in the Shau Valley in the time that I had the company. Later on, like in August or thereabouts, we were rotated back to Camp Evans, where the 3rd Brigade of the division was based. I go back and say that the headquarters was based, and headquarters in 1st Brigade for the division was based at, I'm drawing a blank. 2nd Brigade was at LZ Sally, 3rd Brigade was at Evans, and 1st Brigade and headquarters was at Fire Brigades further south, I forget the name of it. But we went back to Camp Evans, and we would do various missions out and around Camp Evans. One of the things that happened during that time was monsoon season came in. I think that was at that point, and it rained where it was a new record for that area. We had 51 inches of rain in 48 hours, and that was a, you know, anything that wasn't on a hill was.
This was
floating.
69?
Yes, this was 1969. And I don't know the exact date, but I know that that was in 69 while I was in there. The Sergeant Major had detail filling sandbags at the bottom of the hill and putting them to the top of the hill, and the sand was going back down as fast as he could get the sandbags back up there. During that monsoon season time, I still had the company, and I was sent on a mission, ambush mission, probably no more than 5 kilometers outside the base. And I came out there, and before I got there, it started raining, and it rained literally so hard that in daylight I could not see my hand here. And they wanted me out there on ambush. And I deployed my company on ambush, and then we all basically sat there with our ponchos over our heads, and everybody was within shouting distance because you could not otherwise communicate. And when I came in that next morning, I was livid. And I told the Battalion S3, and I told the battalion commander, that was the most useless and idiotic mission I've ever been on in my life. And their comment was, well, if they'd come through there, you wouldn't have thought so. I said, the only time we would have seen them if they came through there was if they'd not into me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have seen anybody. And be that as it might, the battalion commander decided I was not the right person for the job at the time. And I went back to being an S1, and the new S1 became new company commander. But also in the preceding that, my company had been attached to a different battalion, and then to a 3rd Battalion, and then back to our battalion. So I was not under the continuous command of anybody for more than about 2 or 3 weeks. So thereafter, when I was given a officer efficiency report for that period of time, I looked at that, and when I didn't get the officer efficiency report, the formal one, until many months thereafter, when I was back in the United States, and I then decided to file what's called a reclama. In other words, this should not go on my records. And it took a while longer, but that reclama went through for that reason, that I did not serve under any officer long enough to be properly rated. But I finished off as S1, did not have any other fantastic things of interest that I recall, except our brigade commander, while I was still company commander, was Colonel Joseph Conmee. And Colonel Conmee was a tall, straight-haired man who had been a battalion commander in the Old Guard. And I think he was the one who walked in JFK's ceremony. Our sister company, in fact, a company before Captain Felcher, was Captain Womble. And between Captain Jeffcoat and Captain Felcher was Captain Womble. And Captain Womble had been operating in an area where he'd been exposed to a lot of booby traps where his troops at. And what the Viet Cong would do, they would see them coming and they would get 1 or 2 shots, and they'd fire to attract attention, tried to get them to come after them. And they would come after them going through, normally down through trails, etc., where the Viet Cong would have booby traps set up. So in a period of about 2 weeks, he lost like 14 people. Several of them, if not probably half of them, killed. So he went back to the battalion commander and said, I'm not going to do this in that manner anymore. If we get just 1 or 2 shots, we're just going to hunker down, we're going to deploy properly, try to find them, not go hustling down trails. Well, the next time this happened, that's what he was going to do. And he reported the action. And in Vietnam, you normally had the battalion commanders and brigade commanders and division commanders flying one above the other in helicopters listening to what was going on. Well, Colonel Conmee was flying over when Captain Womble reported this action. And Colonel Conmee said, you are not going to hunker down and find those guys. You are going to go after them now. I want some effing body count now. Quote unquote. Well, it took no more than a minute or two before on that same net, our battalion net, that Colonel Conmee had been listening to, comes another voice and says, I forget what Colonel Conmee's call sign was, but Colonel Conmee, this is Silver Eagle. And Silver Eagle was the division, assistant division commander for operations. And he said, I'm at location so-and-so, report to my location ASAP. And as we later heard it, that was the last of Colonel Conmee. And he was relieved on the spot for his comment about the body count. That was not as important as the American troops. And for that I will forever hold the assistant division commander in a lot of awe. So he departed. And recently I had the opportunity to visit Fort Myer in Washington, D.C. And there's a barracks there, or a building there, named for Colonel Conway, that I just found appalling. But be that as it may, so I'm now an S1, and I'm leaving the division, going back to States. We fly back. This time I flew from Benoit, and I flew on a Braniff chartered plane. And Braniff back then was going through the color changes. So they had all these purples and golds and all these vivid colors. And they also had their flight attendants, or as we then called them, stewardesses, in miniskirts. And here's a bunch of GIs that haven't seen a female, especially not a round-eyed female, in a year. And they had these things going around. And I remember the flight quite well. No one slept much. But the one part I remember even more was when we landed at McCord Air Force Base in Washington State. Had an NCO of whatever rank came on board the flight. And he said, as part of his introduction, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen," or I don't know if there were any ladies on board, but before you leave McCord, I strongly advise you to change into civilian clothing. Do not go off the base in your uniform. And that was a sad commentary on the status of our forces in the United States at that point. It's a good break point.
Yeah.
It's a good break point.
Well, we got 5 minutes left.
Okay. Again, I went from McCord, well, I did not go, I went from McCord to Seattle to SeaTac Airport uneventfully. Flew from SeaTac to Chicago, where I spent the night with my in-laws, that previously said my wife had visited with. And then I flew from Chicago to London, and then London to Oslo. And in Oslo, my wife met me at the airport. She'd flown there from Puerto Rico with our daughter, and stayed with my parents, who had moved back to Norway. And they moved back in 1968 because they saw some similarities between their wives after Martin Luther King that reminded them too much of World War II. And they moved back to Norway. And but they met me at the airport, and spent a little bit less than a month in Norway with them, and my wife and daughter. And I then went to my next assignment, which was as an advisor to the reserves in Oklahoma City. That was an uneventful stay. I was a captain, and I advised units, 3 of which were commanded by full colonels, 1 by a lieutenant colonel, and 1 by a first lieutenant. At least I outranked 1 of them. But I learned that the reserves were a very worthwhile part of our overall structure, and a lot of very smart folks in there. I stayed there for a year. While I was there, I applied for airborne school and ranger school, and I in turn got orders sometime about December of 1970 to report to airborne school in February of 71, with subsequent assignment to ranger school, and then subsequent assignment to infantry officer advanced course, all that based at Fort Benning. About that same time, my wife became pregnant, and before I reported to ranger school, I went with her to her OBGYN due to her previous miscarriages. And I said, "Do you think I should go or get this changed?" He said, "I'll tell you what, why don't you go for 3 weeks to airborne school, and let's see how it goes. And then I'll advise you after that." So I went to airborne school, and I went through airborne school as the senior person, so I was a class commander, and got my fair share of harassment being the senior guy, and actually got in shape while I was there. And I stayed with, while I was there, with Lance Patterson and his wife, who had been a company commander with me at Fort Carson. and they were assigned their level base. And but I finished that, came back to Oklahoma City, and the doctor said that basically, if you want the baby, don't go to airborne, don't go to ranger school at this point. So I called my infantry branch officer, and he said, "We'll see if we can schedule it for later." I said, "Great." So I then went to the next assigned infantry officer advanced course class, which I think started in March, and we then moved to Fort Benning, although also at Oklahoma City.
We need to break.
Okay, great.